In this segment, I'd like to demonstrate the movement rules. Now, not all linguistic theories ascribe to movement, and if you're using a linguistic theory or model that doesn't include movement, then you won't even need these rules. But many linguistic theories do include movements of various types, so movement rules are available in TBTA. And in this particular segment, I'd like to illustrate two uses of the movement rules. The first use will be for moving tense auxiliaries in English questions. And I've already written a rule here, a spell-out rule, that will add a tense auxiliary for us. Here's the rule. It will insert a question tense auxiliary, either did, do, or will, for all questions. And if we generate this verse right now, we will see John did read a book. So the question tense auxiliary is being generated and positioned in the VP. And now I'd like to write a movement rule that will move this question tense auxiliary from the VP to the beginning of the clause. So to do that, we could use Grammar Wizard, but I'd rather write the rule myself. So I'm going to double click on the movement rules node, and I'm prompted to enter a group name. Let's call it questions. And now I'll double click on questions on the group name, and we're prompted to select a semantic category. And in these situations, we need to select the syntactic category that is most responsible for triggering the rule that we're going to write. Now we want this rule to be triggered by questions, and questions, that feature, is on clauses, so I'm going to select clauses. Now if you change your mind, you can always change the syntactic category, but we want this rule to be triggered by clauses that are marked as either a content interrogative or a yes-no interrogative. And now we need to build the structure, just like we did back in the feature copying rule. We need to build a structure with all the pertinent constituents. We need a verb phrase with a question tense auxiliary in that verb phrase. So I'm going to select verb phrase and then click here. And now to insert the closing phrase boundary, I'll click there. Now we need to insert a question tense auxiliary. So I'll click inside the verb phrase. Now question tense auxiliary is in a user-defined category. So I'm going to select this option, and there it is right there. And we don't care which question tense auxiliary, we want all of them moved. So we now have a verb phrase that contains an embedded question tense auxiliary. That's all that's relevant to the input structure, so we're going to switch to the output structure. And now I'm going to click on Move, and we'll select the question tense auxiliary. Now the button's label has been changed to Insert, so now we're now ready to specify where we want to insert this question tense auxiliary. And I'm going to click on the opening proposition boundary. So this will move the question tense auxiliary out of the verb phrase to the clause. For the grammar topic, let's select questions. We need to supply a rule for this name, so let's say move question tense auxiliary from the VP to the clause for all questions. Now if we run the grammar, or generate this verse, we see John read a book, ? Did. So our question tense auxiliary has been moved from the VP to the proposition, or the clause, but our clause phrase structure rule didn't know where to position it. And if we rest our cursor here, in the pop-up we see, at the end of the pop-up we see inserted at end by phrase structure rule, clauses, generic, etc. So we need to tell our phrase structure rules, our clause phrase structure rule, where to position this question tense auxiliary. So we need to say insert new constituent into rule. Now question tense auxiliary isn't in this list. When constituents are moved by the movement rules, it's very difficult for this section to know all the constituents that have been moved into clauses. So we're going to type it ourselves. We type question tense auxiliary. Oops. There we go. And it's inserted at the top of the list for us, and that's actually where we want it, so we're going to leave it there. Now, if we generate this verse again, we'll see, did John read a book? And our question tense auxiliary has been positioned by our clause phrase structure rule at the beginning. And that's where we want it. But I'd like to illustrate another capability of the movement rules. When I was in school, I learned the principles and parameters model. And in the principles and parameters model, all movement is done to either CP or CP spec. And I'd like to illustrate that capability using this movement rule. We're going to add another structure to this movement rule. And when you add another structure, the input structure from the previous structure is copied for us, because quite often we want that. But in this particular case, we don't. So I'm going to delete this verb phrase. We do want to specify that the clause's illocutionary force is either content interrogative or yes, no interrogative. What I want this structure to do is insert a node. It'll be a verb phrase called CP. And then we're actually going to move this question tense auxiliary into this new node. And that's what I want to illustrate right here. So we're going to say output structure. And now in the output structure, we're going to insert a new verb phrase. And I'm going to specify that it's a CP. If you're not familiar with principles and parameters, that's fine. The details of this, like CP and CP spec, that's not important. What I'm illustrating here is this particular structure is going to insert a verb phrase into all content questions and interrogative questions. And then I'm going to check this box. Now, these rules, when TBTA executes these rules, it begins with the last structure, and it checks if the last structure matches the semantic representation. If it does, it will execute the output structure. And then it will check this box. If this box is checked, saying after applying this output structure, continues searching previous input structures, then it will move to the preceding input structure and begin checking again. If this box isn't checked, then after it finds a matching input structure, it will make the changes specified in the output structure. Then if this box isn't checked, this rule will be finished and TBTA will move on to the next rule. Now we're checking this box, so it will check this structure, and I'm going to modify this now, and we're going to put our CP spec in here. Now this will have been inserted into the semantic representation by structure number 2 of this rule, and now we're going to move this question tense auxiliary into this verb phrase rather than to the clause. Okay? We'll save that rule. Now I'll initialize, and now we'll generate this verse again, and you'll see that this verb phrase, it was inserted by our movement rule, and our question tense auxiliary was moved from the regular verb phrase to this CP, but we need to tell our clause phrase structure rule where to position this CP, this verb phrase that's marked as a CP. Right now, our clause phrase structure rule just positioned it in the normal place for a verb phrase. So let's go modify our clause phrase structure rule. We're going to insert a new constituent. It'll be a verb phrase marked as CP. We don't need a name. Now this question tense auxiliary will no longer be at the clause, so we're going to delete that. Our question tense auxiliary will be moved into this CP node, the CP phrase. And our CP phrase is at the beginning of the clause, so we'll now get the correct results. I'll say initialize, and generate. And now we get, did John read a book? And our CP node, our verb phrase that's tagged as a CP, has been positioned at the beginning of the clause. Our question tense auxiliary has been moved into this CP node. So now we get the final result, did John read a book? So that's the first capability that I'd like to illustrate for movement rules. The second capability is that movement rules are able to also delete constituents. And for that, I'd like to go to Clauses 190. Now this is an imperative. If you look down here, it produces read a book. In English imperatives, we delete the subject phrase. Now again, we don't have grammatical relations yet, so we're going to make a movement rule that will delete the agent noun phrase. So I'm going to insert a new group into here. Let's call it imperatives. Then I'll double click on that group name. We want this to be triggered again by clauses. Imperatives, we know that a clause is an imperative at the clause level. That's where the feature is. We're going to say this rule will apply to all imperatives. And again, we need to build our input structure. So I'm going to insert a noun phrase. I'll mark it as an agent because we don't have grammatical relations yet. We don't care what's in the noun phrase. That's all that we need for the input structure. So in the output structure, I'm going to say delete the entire agent noun phrase. Let's give this rule a name. Delete the agent NPs in imperatives. I don't think there's a group called imperatives, so let's add a new group. And there it is. Now if we generate this verse, it produces read a book. Now when a constituent is deleted, if you rest your cursor down below at the opening clause boundary, you'll see all the constituents that were deleted. So this tells us John was deleted by the movement rule imperatives, delete the agent NPs in imperatives. That's the rule that we just wrote. So that's the second capability that I'd like to show you for movement rules. And that concludes this segment.